Coordinator of PE Health and Wellness for the Lexington Public Schools. Next to me is Christy Demirev, our Prevention Specialist, K-12, and Tony Serio. He's the Human Services Social Worker for the town of Lexington for youth, correct? I want to acknowledge a bunch of people that are here tonight, and like all the parents and the students here, you've had a full day, but I'd like to thank Dr. Julie Hackett. Is she still here? Our Superintendent of Schools, Chris Lyons, our Assistant Superintendent of Schools, and many administrators, principals, assistant principals, some of our counselors, some of our PE and health staff have come out tonight. And I'd also like to thank Charlotte Rogers, who's the Director of Human Services for the town of Lexington. And I have to have my notes here so I don't forget everything. It's been a long day. Oh, so in terms of who's sponsoring this tonight, the LPS, PE Health and Wellness, our prevention program, the town of Lexington is co-sponsoring this event with us, and our School Health Advisory Council, we refer to it as SHAC. You may see the SHAC around town in the emails, we meet 4 times a year, and we have some of our task force that work out of SHAC, including our Substance Abuse Prevention Task Force, and we are always looking for members of the community to join us to work on some of the efforts that we do. So if you're interested in joining SHAC or you want to be a part of the Substance Abuse Task Force, please see Christy or I, or you can email us at our school address. I'm going to turn it over to you.
Yep. I think the only thing that I really have to add is to make sure that people are aware that LexMedia is filming this. They're only going to film the presentation part, not the Q&A after, but there will be a lot of time for Q&A, so if you have questions, hold them, and we'll go around with the microphones after. Okay.
And the teen bedroom?
Oh yes, and if you didn't get a chance to walk through the teen bedroom on your way in, we call it hidden in plain sight. It's meant to give parents ideas of what to look for in their kids' room that might indicate any type of substance use. We will have it open again at the end of the presentation if you didn't get a chance to go through. Okay? I'm gonna hand you over to Tony.
Without any further ado, we'd like to introduce Dr. Nicholas Chadi. He's from Children's Hospital. He is a pediatric substance abuse specialist. So can we all give him a warm welcome? Thank you.
All right. Can everyone hear me all right in the back? Good. Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure for me to be here, and thank you for coming out late in the evening. Hopefully this is going to be an interesting and captivating topic. It's definitely something that we've been hearing a lot about in the media, something that I see a lot in my practice, and hopefully we'll have a lot of time at the end to answer questions that you might have. So I'll just, by means of introducing myself a little bit more, say a few words about myself so that you know who's actually presenting tonight. So I am a pediatrician. I'm specialized in both adolescent medicine and addiction medicine. I practice in primary care at Boston Children's, as well as in specialized substance use and addiction clinics. So I see teens and young adults in the ranges of 12 to up to 30 years old with different types of substance use issues and problems. And I also work in general pediatrics and primary care. I moved to Boston just a little bit over a year ago. I'm originally from Canada, and I do a lot of research as part of my work, and one of my main focuses recently has been looking into the effects of electronic cigarettes and how they affect the health of young people. All right. So our plan of action for tonight is to talk about several different topics. I'll start with a little bit of an overview about what we can actually call now, quote unquote, a vaping epidemic. We'll talk about different vaping products or e-cigarettes. When I say vaping, I mean using electronic cigarettes. We'll talk a little bit about nicotine and how it affects the teenage brain. We'll talk about other health effects of e-cigarettes. We'll talk about quitting, tips and resources, and then open it up for questions. Okay. I actually want to show you a short video that you might have seen. This is from earlier this spring. This was screened on CNN, and it sort of gives us a little bit of an introduction on what electronic cigarettes are. So let's hope this works. I'm not a Mac person, but hopefully I can figure it out. There it is. Is it on Chrome? It is. Okay. Perfect.
In Milford, Connecticut, high school principal Frances Thompson is desperately trying to snuff out a problem that teachers are having all across the country.
They would come in here, you'd have 4 or 5 kids at a time congregating, and they'd start to vape.
It's a trend that many parents are not even aware of. But e-cigarette use, or vaping, has grown an astonishing 900% among high school students in recent years, according to the Surgeon General. And a 2016 National Youth Tobacco Survey found nearly 1.7 million high school students and 500,000 middle schoolers had used e-cigarettes in just the 30-day period before the survey was taken. In Wrentham, Massachusetts, Assistant Vice Principal Spencer Christie says he too is overwhelmed by this new and pervasive epidemic.
Are JUUL pods. Now it's moved to students vaping in hallways, vaping in classrooms.
In the back, 2 desks in the corner, they had their hands kind of up like this, and there was a blue light coming from between their hands.
The most popular item, which is the JUUL, and as you can see, it looks like a flash drive. It's not. And then the kids can just tuck it away when they're done. So
it's not just the design of these products. Critics say all these flavors also entice kids to start vaping. One study out of Harvard found some of these artificial flavors contain diacetyl. That's a chemical linked to severe respiratory disease.
the kids that I talk to believe that there's nothing in there that's dangerous. They don't think there's anything more than water.
It's not water. It's called e-liquid. And when heated by the coil, it changes to an aerosol. Columbia University researchers using this machine found the vapor has toxic metals like chromium, nickel, zinc, and lead. And as we know, there is no safe level of lead. With very little regulation, people are not fully aware of what they're consuming. I sat down with the FDA Commissioner, Scott Gottlieb, and asked him about this e-cig phenomenon.
Youth use is deeply concerning to me. We're going to be taking some enforcement actions very soon to target companies that we think are marketing products in ways that they're deliberately appealing to kids. I'm going to be having conversations with some of these companies, trying to inspire them, if I can, to take more corrective actions on their own.
Don't forget, nicotine is one of the most addictive substances out there.
I think it's the next epidemic among teenagers.
Dr. Sanjay Gupta, CNN, reporting.
All right. Just sort of an overview of the topic. We'll go into more details about some of the things that were mentioned in there. So I guess as a first question, how popular is e-cigarette use in young people? So in the US, we have several national surveys asking students if they've used substances, if they have mental health issues. And what we know from the 2017 national survey called Monitoring the Future is about up to a third of seniors in high school in 2017 had used an e-cigarette in the past year. I would estimate that if we did that in 2018, and we'll see the numbers coming out in a few weeks, that this number would be a lot higher. So even if we look at 8th graders, so in middle school, a significant proportion of them have tried an e-cigarette in the past year. And we now know that there are more teens that use electronic cigarettes than traditional cigarettes. This is a graph from 2016. And I don't know if you're able to see, because it is written a little bit small. But in that survey, we did ask teens what they thought was in the e-cigarette that they were using. And so the majority of teens think that when they're using an electronic cigarette, there's only flavoring in the little cartridge. Actually, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, 99% of electronic cigarette liquid contains nicotine. So there's a little problem here. If most teens think they're not using nicotines, but almost all of the e-cigarette liquids do have nicotine in it, there's a little bit of, there's a gap there, right? So either there's a lack of information or teens really don't know what they're using. So there's a lot of research looking at the association between using an electronic cigarette and whether or not it will increase your chances of using other types of tobacco products or other substances. So I tried to summarize a little bit what the most recent kind of articles are showing about these risks. And there's a few things that are coming out. So on the one hand, we see that if a young person uses an electronic cigarette, it's sort of a new group of teens who might have not used any forms of tobacco or any smoking at all. And then there is an association between using first an electronic cigarette and then moving on to using a traditional cigarette or other types of tobacco products. And then when young people use electronic cigarettes, they're also more likely to use marijuana and other substances. That works for alcohol and other drugs. So as we can see, thinking about an electronic cigarette is not just thinking about that. It's really about substance use in general, because there are strong associations between those electronic cigarettes that look pretty inoffensive. If you remember from the video, a lot of those newer e-cigarettes, like the JUUL that we'll talk more about later, looks like a flash drive. And the vapor that comes out can have a pleasant fruity smell or dessert kind of smell. So it's hard sometimes to think about the consequences of using something like that that might really be associated with using a lot of the other substances that also may have different side effects or health effects. So it's really hard nowadays, if you're an adolescent or if you're an adult, to live your life without being exposed to a ton of advertising from electronic cigarette companies. So maybe just by show of hands, who's heard about the JUUL? Okay, so that's really everyone. Who has seen advertising from JUUL or another e-cigarette company? Okay, so that's most people also. So there's actually research on that showing that, and that was 4 years ago, 75% or 70% of high school students had been exposed to at least one form of advertising from e-cigarette companies. There's a lot of it online, there's a lot of it from the vape shops. There are more and more vape shops popping up in and around the area here. And there are, advertisings in the windows. There's people vaping or using e-cigarettes on TV and movies and in print media. So it's really hard to go about and not be exposed to what it is. And what's behind that? Well, when we're thinking about how companies present their products, a lot of the time e-cigarette liquids are in colorful bottles. The flavors are like Tutti Frutti or Sweet Mint or, there are so many different names. At first, electronic cigarettes were really meant to be a tool for adults who were regular smokers to quit smoking cigarettes. But when we look at products like those, it doesn't really seem that that's what we're targeting. And really, this is what a lot of the research is showing, is that actually e-cigarette advertising is not directed to adults, but it's directed to kids or teenagers who actually might get a lot of the health harms and none of the benefits from using e-cigarettes. And we'll talk a little bit more about this as we go. So when we think about e-cigarettes or vaping products, they come in all sorts of shapes and sizes. This is only a few examples of what they can look like. So on the far left, we have a device that looks like the JUUL, so kind of flash drive. We call them mods because we can modify and add a pod and a cartridge that contains e-liquids, and all the way up to an electronic pipe or an electronic cigar, or some of, in the middle, those e-cigarettes with big cartridges that we kind of used to see more, I guess, a few years ago. Now they've been really replaced in many cases by the smaller, more high-tech ones. But all of those vaping products have a similar way of working. So when we think of what's inside, there is usually a battery that heats up a metal coil, and that's connected to a cartridge that contains e-liquid or e-juice. And in that liquid, most of the time there's nicotine that's dissolved into a diluent. That could be propylene glycol or glycerin. There's usually some flavoring, and then a number of chemicals, depending on what type of e-liquid it is, all mixed together. And at the tip of the electronic cigarette, there's a mouthpiece. Sometimes there's a little filter. And all that together is the mechanism of e-cigarettes like the JUUL or other types that we can find around us. So just another way of looking at this, there's different ways of putting the liquid in the e-cigarette. So in the JUUL, it comes as a pre-packaged pod. In those larger e-cigarette devices, you need to sort of refill it yourself and buy the e-liquid separately, and we call those large-sized tank devices. There are some medium-sized ones, and there are some e-cigarettes that actually look like traditional cigarettes, but really they have the same mechanism and way of working. So I asked before, who's heard about the JUUL? There's been a lot of media coverage about JUUL. In the New York Times in the spring, there was a series of articles saying that the JUUL that was originally designed for older adults really is so cool that young people are using it a lot more than adults. So right now, there are twice as many adolescents and young adults using the JUUL as there are older adults. And really, that was a product that was originally conceived to be a neat, easy way for older people to quit the habit of using cigarettes. What we're seeing is that that's actually not what happened. And so talking a little bit more about the JUUL, because the JUUL represents more than half of all the e-cigarettes that are sold in the US nowadays. We talked about the little pods. They come in 9 different flavors. Some of them are more like fruity, some are more like dessert, so mango, cool mint, creme brulee, are some of those flavors. And in one little cartridge, it's really very small, about a ½ inch long, there's liquid in there, and that liquid contains as much nicotine as a full pack of cigarettes, right? So if we think of one pod, that usually will last about 200 puffs. And so I work in the clinic, I talk to a lot of teens, and teens tell me that sometimes they use a few pods a week, sometimes they share with their friends, and some teens will use a few pods a day. So if we think about that for a second, that means that they're getting as much nicotine as if they were smoking a few packs of cigarettes a day for something that smells like creme brulee, right? So it's hard sometimes to understand what's really happening with these products when they have all these cool and funky flavors and they look so clean because of the vapor that kind of just looks like water. But really what's inside that is a lot of nicotine. When we think of the price of JUUL, the JUUL e-cigarette or the JUUL pods, so a JUUL starter kit, depending on where you buy it, can come between $15 and $35, depending on if it includes the pods or not. Each little pod sells for about $4. So if we compare that to the price of a pack of cigarettes, that is upwards of $8 to $10, we can get as much nicotine for half the price using an e-cigarette, right? And e-cigarettes are sold in stores, but for young people, a lot of them are sort of just bought from friends or people that can find them. So the price can vary a little bit, but most of the time it does come up more affordable than buying cigarettes. So no wonder that they're so attractive to young people, because they're easy to get and they're pretty cheap. So JUUL is one. There are so many lookalikes. Mark 10 is another kind. And interestingly, there are marijuana e-cigarettes that also just look the same. So a lot of young people who use e-cigarettes use their e-cigarette to vape marijuana products. The latest studies show that it's about 10% of young people who've used an e-cigarette that used marijuana products. That could be an oil, that could be a dry form of marijuana that they placed in the e-cigarette. And that is really a different story, because often these marijuana oils have very high concentration of marijuana. So they're very powerful marijuana products. So we're not talking about nicotine anymore, we're talking about marijuana. And well, marijuana is not the topic of my talk tonight, but we do know that marijuana will have a big effect on how the brain develops and grows, and have a series of other impacts on the health of the body and of the adolescent. So for something starting with an e-cigarette that looks like it's just vapor and flavoring, that can be used to use marijuana products that are pretty powerful, it definitely could be something very risky. So how do young people access the JUUL or e-cigarettes? Well, actually, most teens get them directly from the store. That is a problem. In several towns in Massachusetts, the age to purchase e-cigarettes or nicotine products is 21 above. By the end of this year, all of Massachusetts will be 21 and above. In some towns, it's still 18 plus. But regardless, if you're in middle school or high school, you shouldn't be able to buy it at a store. Many teens get it from a social source, from a friend, from a family member, and only 6% of teens get it directly from the internet. We know that most e-cigarette companies have ways to ask for a proof of age or proof of ID. The one thing that this slide does not show is of these 6% that have tried or that have gotten on the internet, we know that 90% of those teens who try are successful. So most of the time, if you're a young person and you really want to buy it online, there's a pretty easy way to go around those security or safety mechanisms, meaning that either the companies are not trying very hard to control this age limit, or teens are too smart for what's out there to protect them. So I mentioned vaping marijuana a little bit earlier, and so according to surveys, it's 10% of young people who vape marijuana. And it's usually high concentration products. The term that's often used when we talk about vaping marijuana is dabbing, or using a dab pen. And if I can show other images of marijuana e-cigarettes, you'll see that they really look very much alike the nicotine ones. All right. Let's shift gears a little bit, talk about the brain. So brain of an adolescent has a lot of competing interests. Whenever I talk about the brain, I like to show fancy, colorful images of the brain. So what this shows here is what we call functional MRI, or magnetic resonance imaging, of a brain that's growing in age. So from the left, we have the brain of a 5-year-old, and to the right, the brain of a 20-year-old. And what the colors mean is how the brain is kind of maturing and growing. So the more blue and purple you are, the more mature and developed your brain is. And if we actually think of which areas in the brain are the slowest to develop, so top of the brain for the bottom brains is up, and then the kind of top row is if we look at the brain from the side. We realize that parts of the brain that take a longer time to mature is the frontal part of the brain. And if you know a little bit about how the brain works, the frontal part of the brain is what allows us as humans to be a little bit different from animals. So make rational decisions, learn languages, and do complex activities and plan things, but also to understand consequences of our actions. That's something that other parts of our brain can't always do. So this will be my more sciencey looking slide. What really happens here is, if you think of an adolescent, the part of the brain that is able to understand what it feels like to be happy and to feel good and to want a reward is fully working, right? So an adolescent is 100% able to enjoy a good meal, or do something thrilling like going on a bike ride or going skiing, I don't know. But also getting the experience from using a substance. The problem is that the rational part of the brain isn't fully there. So there's a bit of a gap in terms of fully understanding the pleasurable effects of something like vaping or marijuana, and being able to think, maybe that's not really smart for me to do right now. And another way of seeing this is that adolescents are sort of primed to seek a big reward. Because if the consequences don't really matter, why not go for something that feels really good? And unfortunately, things like e-cigarettes or marijuana or other substances can feel really good in the moment. Okay. So when we talk specifically about nicotine, what does it do in the brain? Well, short term, it's a stimulant. So it'll wake you up. And then it will act on different messengers in your brain, or neurotransmitters. Some of them are called dopamine or serotonin or glutamate. And in this time of 10 to 15 seconds, the nicotine will reach the brain, give you an effect that lasts about 30 minutes, and sort of wake you up a little bit and make you feel good in the moment. So that makes it very addictive. You might have guessed. So researchers say that nicotine and cocaine are about as addictive, right? So nicotine is even more addictive than things like alcohol or marijuana. And then one thing that is concerning for me as a pediatrician is that we're finding out that using nicotine when you're an adolescent actually changes the way your brain is going to grow and develop. And the specific parts of the brain that are affected are, one, the reward and pleasure center of the brain, That shouldn't be surprising, because using an electronic cigarette or nicotine feels good in the moment. But it also affects the front part of your brain, that part of your brain that allows you to do and plan and make rational decisions. And it also changes how your emotions are processed, so that part of your brain that channels emotions. So all of this together is not very good for a brain that's trying to grow and get more mature and fully developed. And I don't know if you can see here, but when we're looking at the center of reward and pleasure, that we call in scientific terms the nucleus accumbens, deep in the front part of the brain, it has little receptor sites for different substances. So that kind of part of the brain that has a lot of brain cells responds to nicotine, but also responds to things like alcohol or other drugs like heroin. So if we expose a teenage brain to something like nicotine, that part of the brain gets sensitized, gets sort of more used to being exposed to something that feels really good in the moment, which will explain why teens who use e-cigarettes will have a higher chance of using other drugs, because their brain is sort of looking for that sensation and that feeling. And that's connected to other areas of the brain, like the amygdala, that processes the emotions, and the prefrontal cortex, that allows to make rational decisions. So we can see, as I was saying earlier, that we can't really talk about electronic cigarettes alone without talking about substance use, because in a way, they're all related, especially if we're a teenager. All right, so what are the effects of nicotine on the body? So first, a stimulant. I mentioned that, so you're a little bit more awake. It will reduce appetite. It can make your heart beat fast or give you palpitations. It will increase your blood pressure and your heart rate. So that's the effect of nicotine. We talked about just before that nicotine's effect doesn't last very long, about 30 minutes. So what happens when your body's kind of not under the effect of the nicotine anymore and might be sort of in what we call withdrawal, so seeking more nicotine, because after all, it felt good, why not more? Well, what will happen is teens will often say, if they've been using nicotine for a while and then they stop, well, they'll get a headache, or they'll feel more anxious or more irritable. They'll have a hard time concentrating, they'll feel restless, they'll feel hungry, and they'll feel shivery or tremorous. They'll have sweats, and they'll feel dizzy. So if you think about it, if you're a teen trying to go to school, right? If you're going to class, you can't be vaping all day, right? So if you vape during the rest of the day, but then you try to sit in class and focus, it won't be very long before your body and your brain is telling you, I want more. So what's going to happen? You might get a headache. You might feel anxious or irritable. You might be restless. So we can see very quickly how using e-cigarettes can be a big problem for teens trying to go to school and do well in school. And it's sort of getting trapped in that cycle of wanting to use more to make sure we don't feel bad from not using, and also sort of wanting to use it because it feels good to use, but very short term. So this is kind of a cycle that happens quickly. And when we talk about withdrawal symptoms, and what I mean by withdrawal is when your body's unhappy because it doesn't have the nicotine. Usually teens don't have the same kind of severity of symptoms of withdrawal as adults, but they happen very quickly. So they don't have to be using e-cigarettes for very long, sometimes only a few weeks or months before their body's kind of screaming, I want more. So it happens very quickly for teens to get trapped in that cycle of needing to use more. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about some other health effects of e-cigarettes. Some of you might be familiar with a report that came out in 2016, and I think there was a flyer just at the table at the entrance. So a big report from the Surgeon General in 2016 looking at how electronic cigarettes affect young people. And what does this report say? Well, we talked about the brain. There are risks for the developing brain. There's a risk of developing an addiction. We talked about this. We also talked about how behaviors, so using other types of tobacco products or other drugs or alcohol can happen more if you're exposed to electronic cigarettes. What we haven't talked about yet is that there are also risks for the lungs, the rest of the body, and there are risks of burns from using the product. So let's talk a little bit more about that. So what is in e-cigarette smoke? So we talked about the liquid. So if the liquid is heated up, what happens when we use the e-cigarette? Well, the nicotine gets sort of dissolved in the vapor, so we can absorb it through our lungs. There are other types of chemicals, very small particles that tend to hide in the lungs, that get hidden in the little grapevines of our lungs and can, with time, scar them or create what we call inflammation. So not good for the lung that's trying to grow if we're a teen or trying to stay healthy if we're an adult. There are cancer-causing chemicals in that vapor, and we find a number of them. There are sometimes heavy metals that are dissolved in there as well. So it could be things like lead, like nickel, like tin. And we found all of these in very common e-cigarettes that we can buy online or find in vape shops. And then the flavoring itself sometimes can cause very dangerous scarring and inflammation in the lungs. So we can see that it's not just the nicotine in the e-cigarette vapor that's dangerous. It's a combination of all those chemicals and products that together, and especially if used for a long period of time, can be very damageable for the lungs. The problem is, e-cigarettes have not been around for very long. So with cancer, or with cigarettes, we know that if you smoke cigarettes for many, many years, there are big chances that in the end you'll get lung cancer, right? But we don't have people who've used e-cigarettes for long periods of time. Will they eventually develop the same types of cancer, different types of cancers? The answer is we don't know. We don't know yet. But what we do know is that what's in the vapor of these e-cigarettes is oftentimes, in many ways, similar to what we find in traditional cigarettes. A lot of people will say, well, there's not that same tar, it's not as, smelly and disgusting as gross as traditional cigarettes. Fair enough. But the problem is the control on what's in those e-liquids doesn't exist. Who's going to go and check? There's no FDA that's controlling what's in the e-liquids. So really, those companies creating those products can decide what they want to put in there. So the question is, when young people are using e-cigarettes, do they know? Do they think about what's going into their lungs? And so that's an important question to think about. So in the long term, we think that using an e-cigarette versus a traditional cigarette may be less of a hazard. Maybe. But we do know that there's a list of those cancer-causing chemicals that are in there. Some of the words that you might have heard, I have a hard time saying them: acrylonitrile, acrolein, propylene oxide, acrylamide. I'm not even going to try that last one. But you can see there are several complex chemicals that are mixed in that vapor that might just smell like creme brulee or cool mint. So that's really hard to forget, especially when we have a lot of marketing from those companies that make us want to think that it's kind of fruity and candy-like. Has anyone heard of popcorn lungs? By show of hands. Interesting. So popcorn lungs is something that went viral on social media a few months, or almost a year ago, I would say. So what happened actually is a teenage girl was brought to the emergency room very quickly because her lungs stopped working. She was having trouble breathing. And she told the doctors that she had been using an e-cigarette for almost a year, maybe a little bit more than a year, was using it, a lot of it. And what the doctors found is that her lungs looked a little bit like popcorn. And why did we call this popcorn lungs? Well, yes, because her lungs looked a little bit like popcorn, like they were a little bit chewed up. But it goes back in time because decades ago, we looked at the lungs of people who worked in factories that were making popcorn. And there's a lot of flavoring in popcorn. And what we found in those people's lungs was that their lungs also looked like popcorn. There's a lot of popcorn here, right? And so what this all means is that the flavoring from these e-cigarettes itself can chew up the lungs, and we were finding the same patterns in a young person using e-cigarettes that we had found decades ago in people who had been exposed to toxic flavorings in their workplace. So we don't have a lot of these cases yet. Are we going to see more? I don't know. Time will tell us. But if we don't use e-cigarettes, probably we won't have this problem. So that's one thing. Some people might have heard of dripping. Dripping is a technique that a quarter of teens who've used e-cigarettes have tried. And what that means is taking the e-cigarette apart, so removing the mouthpiece and exposing the heating coil and dripping some e-cigarette liquids directly on the coil. Then what happens after is the young person will inhale or breathe in that vapor directly from above the coil. It's more concentrated, there's no filter. It's very hot because the coil is burning and heating. And why people do it is because it gives sort of a higher, a stronger effect. It can give you a head rush even more than if you use the e-cigarette as it's designed to be used. And there are obviously some burn risks that come with it. So I apologize ahead of time for the next slide. Close your eyes if you're sensitive. But this is what might happen. And we're seeing more of this. So e-cigarettes, when we play with them and we change the way they're kind of connected to the heating, or we try to tinker with it, can explode. And this has happened, probably will happen again. There are more and more cases of people getting e-cigarettes exploding in their pocket while they're not using it, possibly because it's been modified, or simply while they're using it. So that's something to be aware of. Okay, the slide has changed for those that had their eyes closed. So those were some of the risks. There are probably some more that we don't know yet, but in general, as we can see, there are risks to the brain, to the lungs, to the body. So e-cigarettes really are something to be taken seriously. So what if you or a friend or someone you know is using an e-cigarette and they want to quit because they hear about the side effects or the negative effects and they don't want to be stuck in that cycle where they have to use more and more just to feel good? Well, first things first, there's a big report that came out earlier this year that wanted to make sure that something that we at first designed to be a helpful tool. So e-cigarettes were really designed to help older people stop smoking. And let's face it, cigarette smoking is the #1 killer in America right now. So there was a big stake here. The problem is, e-cigarettes can be perhaps helpful for adults over the age of 25 that are regular smokers. What this report showed from the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine is if you're under 25, because your brain is still developing, there actually is no advantage to using an e-cigarette, even if you're a regular cigarette smoker. And that's because of all the health effects that we've discussed. And actually, the risk of taking up smoking when you weren't actually a smoker in the first place. So really, e-cigarettes should not be used for smoking cessation in teens. All right, now that that's clear, what if we are using e-cigarettes and we want to quit? Who do we talk to? Several people. I think that having a conversation is really a first step and very important. So talking to parents, family, friends, at school. More and more schools have resources, have policies about e-cigarettes, and kind of connections with people that can help. So it could be talking with a school counselor, a nurse, teacher, vice principal, whoever we feel comfortable. And then your doctor. I'm a pediatrician. I specialize in substance use treatment. And this morning, I was talking to 200 pediatricians in Waltham and telling them very similar things that I'm telling you. So pediatricians, family doctors are becoming more aware of this as an issue, and they can help. So if you want to quit or you know someone who wants to quit, having that conversation with a health provider can be a great step. All right, I mentioned the first one, having an open conversation. And what that might look like is trying to weigh the pros and cons. We talked about a lot of the cons. I will say that because I'm a doctor and I want you to be healthy. There might be pros. Right? Teens use e-cigarettes because it's social, because a lot of people do it, because it looks cool, because they want to fit in. So having a conversation trying to weigh those pros and cons, possible advantage and then versus something that might be damageable for your health now and later is very important. So getting informed will help to answer those questions and be able to compare the pros and cons. Coming to an event like this is great. There are lots of good sources online that we'll go through a little bit later, or talking with another provider or professional. And then if we've kind of thought about it and we're thinking, okay, I want to do this, I'd like to quit, or my friend wants to quit, how can we help? Well, we have to set realistic goals. Maybe it's not realistic to quit right away. A little bit like quitting smoking. It's not easy. We've talked about it. Nicotine is very addictive. So cutting right away will make your body not feel good. So we want to think of, are we able to cut down first? Or if we're going to quit, who are we going to tell around us to support us? Or are we going to tell our doctor that it can also help? And then finding a helping hand. And what's been shown is that if you have a counselor, it could be a school counselor, it could be a counselor in the community, to help you with your goals, it helps a lot. And it increases your chances of being able to quit vaping or not using anymore. So when we think about making a change, what are we doing here? We're sort of thinking, first, no, not me. I can't quit. I can't do this. To, well, maybe, okay. To, well, so okay. What do I do now? To, let's do this. and then eventually it is possible. And this is really what a counselor, someone who's helping you out as a young person, can do. So there's a lot of talk among doctors about nicotine replacement treatment. So you might have heard of the nicotine patch, you might have seen a nicotine patch. A few years ago, we used to think of nicotine patches for things that were mostly used in older adults as another way to try to quit smoking. What we know now is that nicotine patches or nicotine gums or nicotine lozenges can be used safely for young people, including adolescents, who want to quit using e-cigarettes. And they're usually safe with minor side effects. And that's something that, as a young person or as a parent, would be discussed with your health provider, your doctor, or your nurse practitioner. And there are other medications that can help also support quitting. Again, a conversation to have with a doctor. Sometimes your doctor might know some of it, might not. So it's sometimes just good to ask your doctor what they know about it and if they've heard about it. And if they're not aware, encourage them to get informed, because this is a rapidly evolving topic. So some doctors might be comfortable with it, some might not. I'm reassured that more and more doctors are contacting me or people in our team to kind of get ideas of how to deal with this, but things are moving fast. All right, I mentioned resources, so I'll share a few with you if this is a topic that you're interested in or that maybe you think your friend should be interested in or someone you know or someone in your family should read more about. So I wrote an article a few months ago that's on the health blog for Boston Children's that summarizes a lot of what we've been talking about tonight. A lot of helpful links on that article if you're interested. There's several different sources of information online. I think that some of the most helpful are some coming from large professional organizations like the Academy of Pediatrics. They have a whole page on what they call electronic nicotine delivery systems, what I call e-cigarettes. Same thing. So lots of kind of facts there and questions answered. They've created a fact sheet specifically on the JUUL, again, the American Academy of Pediatrics, that you can find. If you Google JUUL Fact Sheet, American Academy of Pediatrics, you'll find it. So what's a JUUL? How does it work? What's in there? That's all online. Raise your hand if you've seen these images. So this came out in September. A lot of press around electronic cigarettes. The FDA Commissioner, Scott Gottlieb, made a strong statement going after the 5 major e-cigarette companies in the US, saying that they would look into their marketing strategies and give them a very short period to change them, to make sure that e-cigarettes aren't marketed to young people. We're still in this 60-day period. We'll see if something will actually come out of that. There's a lot of press around, cutting down and being tough on these electronic cigarettes, but we don't know. The other thing that the FDA did is create kind of an education campaign that really, for the first time, presents vaping as something that's damageable for health and a little bit like an epidemic. So the pictures that we see here are young people that are sort of getting infested by a parasite, and what we find out at the end of the video is that that parasite is vaping and nicotine and those substances that go to the brain and the body. So if you're interested, you can click on this, there's an epidemic or CDC or FDA, and you'll find it'll come up on YouTube. They also created an interactive video game platform that I tried. So a little bit like the room that we have outside, there's an online room that you can go into to learn all about e-cigarettes and try to find the different clues on what's in there and what are the chemicals. I guess I'm getting too old for video games. It took me a little while to get through, but I think it's kind of a fun way to also get more information out there about what e-cigarettes are. If thinking or talking about e-cigarettes has triggered some interest about other substances, we've talked a little bit about marijuana today. One site that I recommend is the National Institute of Drug Abuse. They have a page for teens, teachers, parents. They're all separate and they have different facts about all sorts of different substances. They have a page on nicotine and e-cigarettes. They have a page on marijuana and other drugs. They have activities that can be done alone or with friends. They have quizzes. So definitely a nice way to learn more. And this is a new resource that's available at no cost, partnership between Boston Medical Center and Partnership for Drug-Free Kids, so a 24-hour helpline, just to talk about any resources available. It could be related to vaping or e-cigarettes, could be related to other problems with substance use, so that's free. You can just call this number and ask to speak with a counselor that will help direct to resources close to where you live, or give you some tips on how to support someone that might be having trouble with substance use. I mentioned that I work at Boston Children's Hospital. This is a picture of my team. So we have 4 pediatricians, a psychiatrist, 4 social workers, a program coordinator, and we see teens anywhere between 12 and 23 when we start seeing them, and then we can follow them up to age 30 for all sorts of questions or problems related to substance use. So if it happens that your doctor says, I don't know what to do with vaping, well, give us a call. So parents can call, doctors can call, and we're always happy to try to help answer questions about e-cigarettes or other substances. All right, this is bringing me towards the end of kind of the formal presentation. So I want to leave you with a few take-home messages, and then we'll open it up for questions. So we talked about e-cigarettes as being very common. We talked about an epidemic, so more and more adolescents are using e-cigarettes, and it's not showing signs of slowing down anytime yet. We talked about e-cigarettes and the risks that they can have for health of adolescents. We talked about brain risks, body risks, lung risks, risk of using other substances. We definitely talked about how e-cigarettes should not be used as a tool to quit smoking in adolescents. Adults is a different story, but adolescents, absolutely not. And then we also talked about how parents, schools, health providers can help have a conversation or quit vaping if that's something that we want to do. So I'll open it up for questions. Thank you for your attention.